Hello and welcome to this session. My name is Ben Watt, and in the next 45 minutes, I'm going to show you a couple of features in Power BI that will help you scale and secure your Power BI solution for a much more enterprise and broader audience. The two things we're going to look at are shared datasets and data flows. So we'll jump over, have a look through the slides, and we'll see some demos, and there's some content for you at the end in my GitHub, so you can try all of this yourself. Enjoy this session, and I hope you're enjoying the Scottish Summit. So here we are on our first slide. It's just our title slide, but the first thing we're going to really kick into is looking at the sponsors for the Scottish Summit. If you just take a moment and have a look through these sponsors, Hitachi and Redspire, Agilysys, DQ Global, and ScriptRunner. They're fantastic sponsors for helping put this summit on and making it such a great event. Just a little bit about myself. So I run a consulting company here in Dublin, and I have a focus on Power BI. You can follow my Twitter handle that's just on the slide there, and there'll be some more details for you at the end if you want to get in touch. So the agenda for today's session is, first thing is a history lesson. So when we're talking about architecture of a BI solution, we want to see what it looks like through the ages. So we're going to have a bit of a diagram of how a BI solution looks and what the technologies have looked like over the ages and how they've grown and where they are today. And then that will link into the Power BI data flows and shared data sets that we're going to deep dive a little bit into today. The first thing we will look at is what does a simplistic Power BI architecture look like? So that is for those of you who've just started out, you open up a PBIX file, you connect to some data, you create some reports, and then you publish it. Everything is encased in one single file. Then we'll talk about the two things, data flows and shared data sets, and we'll have some demos, and we're going to take a simple architecture and we're going to grow it up and split out those components using data flows and shared data sets to see what an evolved architecture looks like. And right at the end, you'll see some links to slides and content for you to try this in your own time. Let's do a short history lesson in Microsoft Enterprise BI. The diagram across the top is what a very typical BI solution looks like. From a small solution to an enterprise scale solution, it does effectively all of these things. We start on the left with our source data system. So the two icons there are representing a plethora of business systems that are out there, starting with basic Excel files or CSV files, right up to enterprise databases, and indeed application data that you can acquire through the web and APIs and so on. Lots and lots of source data out there running your business. Then there's tools to acquire or simply get that data. And just underneath those icons, you will see the technology that is, say, on-premise. We can see SQL Server like SSIS, which is a tool for acquiring data. And in the cloud, we have Azure Data Factory. It's the same tool doing the same thing, just in a different location. We have the storage of that data. So once we've acquired it, we've brought it in, we've done a little bit of transformation and restructuring of that data if necessary, and we would store that in a relational database, generally known as a data warehouse or containing data marts. But effectively, it's rows and columns of data ready for you to start querying. On top of that then is the semantic model. Now I'll make this point once, and maybe once or twice more after that, but the semantic model is the intelligence part of business intelligence. It's the powerful thing that takes your data and adds the smarts and the metrics and the ability for you to be very clever and get analytical with your data in a very easy to consume fashion. A semantic model will generally read data either in real time or more commonly on a processing or a schedule basis. And that data is then stored in a couple of different places. Power BI stores that data in memory, but there are disk-based versions of that as well. So we can see underneath there SSAS and Azure Analysis Services. Effectively, it's the same product. One is based in the cloud and one is based on premises. And then the last thing is our visualization. So this is the nice thing we get to look at the end. It's the way that we look for trends and we look for outliers using the right visualization, line charts or bar charts, sometimes pie charts, and it helps us to make decisions, find insight in our data, and take action. So starting from the left, we have business systems. We get it, we store it, we model it, and visualize it. Every solution effectively does the same thing. At the bottom of this diagram, you'll see what the technology has looked like through the ages. On the bottom left, you'll see a diagram that, for those of you who've been around a while, will know as the BI burger. It kind of gives it away just looking at it. Don't worry if you can't read the context of that, the content of that image. It's just to show you that back in the day, 15 years ago or so, there was multiple layers of products allowing you to do the things of getting data, storing it, and so on. And then if we move over to the last diagram, we'll see that that's the current diagram that's available on the Microsoft website for a modern BI architecture. Not every architecture has to look like that, but you'll see effectively it's doing the same thing. Data sources on the left, churning that data and visualizing it at the other end. This slide is showing us how Power BI relates to the previous slide of all the components in building out a BI solution. If we look at Power BI Desktop, we have an icon here. When you open that on your desktop, you can perform almost all of the functions that we saw before. So in Power BI Desktop, you can press the Get Data button and you'll open up Power Query, and that will allow you to connect to and acquire and transform data from lots of different data sources. There is no storage component in Power BI, so there's no relational database or flat structure that is staging your data anywhere. The result sets of your query are injected directly into your semantic model. Power BI uses the same SQL Server Analysis Services engine under the bonnet for your semantic model, and that allows you to create relationships between your different result sets, add DAX calculations, and as said before, it's the intelligence part of business intelligence. Still within Power BI Desktop, you can create your visualizations. You can have one to many report pages. All are pulling data from your semantic model, and then you can publish that to Power BI Service. On the diagram here, you can see once we have acquired some data and created our data model with relationships and some nice cool DAX calculations, and we've created a number of pages of reports, we can save that and press the Publish button, and it will then work its way into the Power BI Service. Power BI Service is made up of multiple workspaces, which you can secure to different parts of your organization. If we take this example here, this one we published to a finance workspace, but what you see is two different items that are in the result. We have a data set, which is effectively your semantic model or your analysis services cube, and you have your visualizations. Those are separated in your workspace, and we'll see that in a moment. Then optionally, you can schedule your data set to refresh on a recurring basis. Depending on what license you have, you can do that daily, weekly, and up to a number of times a day, again, depending on which license you have. So when does this solution work well, and when do you need to leave it as it is and not worry about scaling it up? If the number of report pages is minimal, and by minimal, I mean maybe less than 10, it's okay. If the type of people looking or the audience of your report is consistent, meaning they are all looking at the same reports, and again, it can stay in one place. What can happen though is if your model, your data model, has lots of different data in it, different people will want to look at different types of reports, and you don't want them tripping over each other with 10, 15 pages of reports and only 2 or 3 are relevant to them. You want to start to separate them out and organize them for people to see only what's relevant to them. And also if the amount of development that you're doing is minimal, meaning that your queries remain fairly consistent, it doesn't change on a regular basis, again, one file is perfect for a small audience and a consistent audience solution. The next thing we're going to look at is how to change this though. So we are going to break these things up, and we're going to look through data flows and shared data sets. But first of all, let's look at an example Power BI file that is made up of one Power BI file that's doing all of these, and we're going to deploy it and see what happens in the cloud, and then we're going to start to break this particular file up. So what we're looking at here is an example solution called Vandingo, and I've called it Single BI, and that's to remind me and to remind you that this is the example of just everything encompassed in a single file. The first thing we're going to look at is our get data or our queries. And you can see here we've got 6 different queries that are pulling data from different places. If we look at our products query, for example, you can see that the result set is nice and clean. We have a product ID, so we have a unique key, which is very important in your data model design. And on the right-hand side, you can see all the steps that it took me to get to this result set to look nice and clean as it is. And that's a very important part of your solution design, is having nice structured data in the end result. Let's have a look at the first step. If we go to source, you can see this particular query is connecting to an Azure storage blob. And within that storage blob, if we filter down a couple of steps, you'll see eventually that it's actually just an Excel file stored in Azure. And I'm going to get to the step where we have the contents of that file. This is within the file, and you can see there's lots of different steps that I'm needing to do to get a nice clean result set, which is ready for my ready to load into my data model. So lots of different steps here. And one really important component is the result set that I have here could be used by other people, but they can't use it because it's all contained within this PBIX file. And this is what we're going to get to a little bit later on. I'll close. And next thing we're going to look at is our data model. So here's our products, the result of our products query, and here's all the columns that were in that query. We have our other queries, and then you can see between them there's relationships. So a product has a manufacturer. It can have multiple manufacturers. A manufacturer can manufacture multiple products. Products can have multiple sales, and we have sales on particular dates and geographies and so forth. It's really important as part of your model, or your data model design, is to get these relationships right, making your end report creation a lot easier. This is really data modeling 101, and I'm not really going to cover that today, but it is an important part of designing a really efficient Power BI model. Last but not least is the reports. So we've done the hard work of querying the data. We've done the hard work of modeling the data. Some of us might be good at DAX, but it's a learning curve. All the same, once you've got it structured really well, you can start to create your reports. This example only has only has 1 page of a nicely designed report, and you can see I've titled this one up here with basic version. Because that's going to come into play a little bit later on. But again, the visuals are not really part of the deep dive of today's session. It's just how things are structured. I temporarily created a new report here, just looking at my total sales by year, and I can swap that. Let's swap that to a different type of chart. Maybe just change the color to something else. Nice and red. Not a very good color because red has bad connotations, but this is only a demo, so it doesn't really matter. And anyway, that's good enough for this. I'll go back to my report page. And what I'm going to do is publish this PBIX file to my Power BI workspace. So nice and simply publish, evolve viz. This is the example workspace that we're going to use today. I'm going to pop it open. You can see right now that it's empty. Nice timing, there it is. Your data set is ready. Do you want to view the data set or get quick insights? Nice little feature is get quick insights. It does some automatic analysis of your data set. Hit and miss, but sometimes it throws up some cool stuff. So here's my 2 objects. I have a data set. We can see that the icon is this orange one that looks like a database, and it's here called data set. We have our report, which is the 2 pages of reports that we saw, and that report is pulling its data. It's connected to the data set. So they are separate items in Power BI workspace, but they are linked to each other. And again, that's important later on when we talk about shared data sets. So let's open the report just to prove that's the report that we looked at. And we look at page 1. We should see our red chart, column chart like we saw before. So that is our solution, all encompassed in one PBIX file. The next thing we're going to do is break this up, and we're going to talk about data flows and shared data sets. So we're going to start to talk about scaling up. Data flows are a very neat feature in Power BI. What they do is allow you to decouple your query component of your solution into a completely unique feature and published in the Power BI service. The result of a data flow is stored as an entity or effectively a table in the service that you can then pull down into your Power BI desktop file. But more importantly, it allows other people to run that query as well. That's very powerful if your query is doing something very cool. It's connecting to some data locations that are not accessible for everybody, performing very well-structured transformations on it, and it means that everybody can use that data and get consistent result sets through their analytics and their own Power BI solutions that they might build. It does act like the ETL layer of a solution. ETL being extraction and transformation and loading. It allows you to completely independently write queries, publish them and schedule them as a completely different service for you and other people to use. Data flows are developed in the browser. There's no Dataflow desktop product as such, but you can write your queries or write your data flows in Power BI desktop just like you did before, and then simply copy and paste them into the service as a data flow. My current recommendation is to generate or create your queries in Power BI desktop. The user interface is a little bit easier for those early phases of writing a query, and then you can simply take the result of that query or the M language we're going to look at in a moment and copy that and paste that in as a data flow in the cloud. The result of your data flow is stored in Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 as a common data model compliant folder. With Power BI Pro, you get 10 gigabytes of space, and with Power BI Premium license, you get 100 terabytes, which is enormous. But the only thing is that you can't access those data flow results other than using Power BI Desktop, except when you choose one option at a workspace level is to use your own Azure storage that you've created and provisioned, and your result set is then stored in that storage. The only difference with that is that you have to pay for that storage, but it does mean that the results are then accessible outside of just Power BI Desktop. Some features in data flows are for premium only, and these can catch you out if some of the things that you're doing in your desktop queries might not be compatible with the Pro license version of data flows. One example being parallel refreshes. So if you have a PBIX file with 5 queries in it, if you publish all of those in as a single data flow, those queries are actually run sequentially. So it can take a little bit longer to run. But what we're going to do is we're going to take our first solution that we started with. So here's our single BI solution again. And we want to move all of the queries into the cloud and start to load the data from data flows instead of the query logic being contained within this PBIX file. Now I'm going to leave this solution as it is, and I'm going to create a brand new solution, or just a new PBIX file. And this one here is called the Vandingo Evolve DWH. So this is going to serve 2 purposes, which is data flows and shared datasets, which we'll get to shortly. But the first thing I want to do is look at the transform data or my queries within this file. We can see that if we look at our sales and geography and manufacturer, the same sort of result sets. There's my products, my product ID, segment and category, all the same stuff that we saw before. But if we look right over to the right-hand side here, you can see that there's virtually no transformation happening. This is pulling data just as it is from the source. If we look at our source step, and what it's using as a connector is Power BI data flows. So this is not pulling the data from the Azure storage where my Excel and CSV files are saved. It's pulling it from the Power BI service as a result set of a data flow. The navigation step here, you can see that the entity that I'm pointing to is called products. So I have a data flow in my Power BI service with an entity called products, and all of that query stuff was done in the cloud inside the data flow. It's the same thing for all of my other queries. Manufacturer, just connecting to a data flow, and we have our result set. So how did I create those data flows? Let's take a look. Here is my original set of queries again. And having done the hard work here, I don't want to have to redo it. So I'm just going to simply copy and paste one of these. So I'm going to take my products query here, for example. Here's all the applied steps. I want to copy this query into a data flow. Under the bonnet of this query, if we go into the advanced editor, and I'm not going to linger on this component in this session too long, but you can see multiple steps are being applied, and these steps here align to the steps that we see in our applied steps, and the functions that you can see call, say, for example, select rows and expanding data, skipping rows and promoting headers. These are all functions that are applied using the M language that result in your data getting tidier and tidier as it gets towards the end result. I'm going to simply paste this in and create a brand new data flow, having done the work already in my Power BI service. If I look at my Evolve DWH workspace, this is where I want to keep the data layer, basically everything except reports, in my new evolved solution. So in my evolved DWH workspace, you can see I've already created 3 data flows, and they're these are the ones I built earlier, but let's create a new one from scratch. New and data flow. And in today's session, we're going to look at creating new entities. You can link other entities from other data flows. You can import data flows that you've exported previously. But today, let's just add a new entity. What comes up first is the interface for you to start creating a report inside the user interface of Power BI. So if I selected, for example, Azure SQL database, it would ask me for my database here, database.windows.net, and my database here, and I would connect to it and authenticate. It would then allow me to see the tables, and I could start pulling those down. This allows you, and this would then give you the same user interface, or a very similar user interface that you see in Power BI Desktop. But today we've already done our work, so we don't have to go through those steps. I'm going to add a new entity. And today we're just going to run blank query. So if you've already done the work, we start with a blank query, and you can see the structure here is let, and then in, which is outputting your end result set. I'm going to override all of that with what I did before, and I'm going to press next. And the first thing that it's going to ask me is how to authenticate to that source. Now, my source in this example query is Azure Storage. I have my account key ready to go, and I'm going to press connect. And it's now going to authenticate, run those steps, same as it did before. My result set is exactly the same, and I'm going to call this one new product Scottish Summit, for example. Save and close. Now it'll take a moment to validate this query and start to save the metadata, and then it's going to pop up and say, okay, you've created an entity, but let's name this data flow, and I'll show you the structure of that. Let's call it, I've done this before, let's call it Scottish Summit Demo. Oops. Save. And it's going to ask me, do I want to refresh it now? And I'm going to say yes. And that's off and running its refresh. If I close and go back to my workspace, you can see here is my new Scottish Summit Demo data flow. The icon here is telling me that it's currently refreshing. Inside this data flow is one entity. So it is possible you can have multiple entities within a data flow. So a data flow is kind of the container, and the entities are the result sets of your various queries. Let's look at another one. Here's my dimensions. I've got a geography dimension, a product dimension, and manufacturer. Those 3 will all refresh inside this data flow, and they all run on the same schedule. So whenever this data flow is scheduled, all 3 of those entities will refresh. My Scottish Summit demo has finished. If I go here and look at my refresh history, you'll see it completed. It took 31 seconds, and now the result of this new product table is ready for me and for my colleagues to start acquiring and using that data in our own Power BI solutions. So I'm going to pop back open my new solution. We can close all these ones down. this one. So this is my new solution. So step 1 of 2 has been done. My queries inside this solution are all contained here, and all of these queries are connecting to Dataflows. We can see, and we look at the source, every single query is connecting to a data flow. So my logic has been decoupled from this solution. The refreshes are happening in the cloud, and other people can use that result set for their solutions. So step 2 of this process is going to be to decouple the data model component. So if I look at this diagram here, you can see that my data model is still the same. The results are coming from data flows, but how do I share this with other people and not have to create my reports inside this file? That's the concept of shared datasets, and that's the next thing that we're going to look at. Shared datasets is another decoupling of a component of your Power BI solution to allow you to deploy and secure those items uniquely, and more so allow you to separate reporting into different areas for different people to have a nicer user experience when your solution becomes a little bit more complicated. The concept of decoupling the shared datasets is where you have a PBIX file that plays just one role. It's not a different file, or it's not a different structure of a solution. It just means that your PBIX file is only acquiring data, and it's only doing the data modeling, but you don't create any reports within that PBIX file. That PBIX file, which serves as the query and data model, or just the data model layer, is published into a completely unique workspace, which is designed just for those data asset objects, so that your data transformation, your data set logic is all stored into a data warehouse type workspace. And then your end users have access to reports, which are not published in the same location, but into their own workspaces that are relevant to them. So finance people can look at finance-related reports in a finance workspace, and sales people, sales reports, sales workspace. They don't really need to see the data set in the workspace. They do need to be able to read from it though, and we're going to see how that works in terms of a security. The shared data sets use the concept of a live connection. So the reports that you publish for your end users in your finance and your sales workspaces are just live connected to the data set that you published into a different workspace. Lots of moving parts, and we're going to see all that in action in just a moment. The concept of this allows you to simplify the process of publishing changes to your reports and indeed your data model, because if everything is contained in one file, it means that you have to publish your query, you have to publish your data set and the model, and all of the reports in one go, which, if the solution is quite large, can take some time. Publishing just reports that are live connected to a data set is very simple. The files are very small. There's no data really contained within them. It's just the visuals that are contained in those files. And users can create their own reports and publish them to their own workspace. And again, you have a much more enterprise structure and organization of your BI solution. Let's look at our demo solution again. We're going to see the queries that are using data flows. We're going to see the data model, which is the exact same sort of data model, and we're going to publish that to the cloud. And then we're going to look at how to create reports that use that data model and how to secure them for different people. So let's jump over to our example. Here is my new Vandingo Evolve DWH solution. This one, again, all of my queries are connected to my data flows. Everything is nice and hunky-dory there. And if we look at the data model, this is the exact same data model as we saw in our original solution. No difference whatsoever. Relationships are the same. DAX calculations are the same. The file type is exactly the same. The only thing missing from this file are pages of reports connecting into that data model. I could technically, if I wanted to, create a report inside this data model and publish that values, and publish that as part of this file. So there's nothing actually stopping me from doing that. But from a design point of view, I'm going to restrict myself from creating visualizations in this file and use it just as that data set, or just for that data set purpose. If I close that, you'll see that I have a page here. It's actually not possible to create a PBIX file without any pages of reports. So I kind of tend to create a single page here just with a text box to say, hey, this is the data model. Once I've published that to the cloud, I can then go ahead and delete that, or I can leave it. It doesn't really matter. It serves no purpose. But what we don't want is a whole bunch of reports pages to be created in this data model. So just like before, I'm now going to publish this. And I'm going to publish it into my Evolve DWH workspace. And if we pop over and have a look at that workspace, so while that's publishing, if we look at while that's publishing, the purpose of the DWH workspace, or this data warehouse workspace, is really intended for two things to live inside here. One are data flows. This is where I, as a BI developer, am going to play my role in publishing objects that run queries, that bring the data and structure it into an organized output, and also to publish my data sets, which I'm then going to share for other people to create their reports. You can see my two objects have been published here. If I open up my report page, here's my placeholder. I can actually go ahead and delete that. It's not really going to matter whether I do or don't keep that. I mean, every time you publish it again and again, that page is going to pop back up again. And it's up to you if you continually delete it or not. But there is the result now of my more enterprise architecture. So in this workspace here, I have a data set, which is doing the data modeling or the semantic layer function. I have my data flows in here, which are doing the query and transformation function. But where do I put my reports, and who gets to see them? So this is where my workspace Evolve Viz is going to come back into play. Here's my previous one. So within here, my end users can see this data set unless they have viewer only access, for example. But this is where we only want to keep components for people to run reports. So what I'm going to do as an end user, what I'm going to do as a developer is I'm going to create a new report that's live connected to that shared to that data set. So I'm going to open up a new Power BI desktop file. And I'm going to pretend that I'm a report developer who's publishing reports for the finance team. And I'm going to create a finance specific report. I don't want to get any data, and I don't want to do any modeling. I just want to use the data model that I've already published. And I can actually connect directly to that. So if we press Get Data, and just like we saw before, we can connect to our text files in our databases. But the nice one of this process is connecting to Power BI datasets. So the work has been done by a BI developer. The datasets and the data flows and the datasets have been published. Here's my Evolve DWH dataset. So I'm selecting on that. Now, you can't really see that there, but it is kind of just highlighted there, and I have my Create button ready to go. So I'm going to press Create. It's now going to do a live connection and query the result sets of that dataset. You can see here's all the fields that were available inside the dataset. And down the bottom, you can see that this is connected live to the Power BI dataset, Van Dingo Evolve DW in the Evolve DWH workspace. A new feature that's just come out is that I can make changes to this model, so I can now inject my own tables into this model and make this what's called a direct query over a Power BI dataset and create what's called a composite model. But again, that's not really part of today's session. So let's create an example report. I'm going to take my my calendar and look at year and put my sales on it. And we can see, like we saw before, let's just create something else just so we can make this a nice complete demo. I'm going for a pie chart. I always do pie charts in my demos because I love the discussion that they create. And I'm going to make this the ugliest pie chart as possible. Category and values. There we go. So there's my report. And again, this PBIX file is not doing any work other than connecting live to my data set. So I'm going to save this and call this Scottish Summit Demo. And I can now go ahead and publish. And I want that in my visualization workspace because this is where I'm keeping my reports. And let's pop back over to my Evolve Viz workspace. Here's my new report that's just been published. And if I open that up, here's the report that we saw, and we can do all the filtering and cool stuff like we all know and love in Power BI. But that report is now connected to, it's published in the Evolve Viz workspace, but the data resides in the Evolve DWH workspace. And that's great. So now I want to switch over and pretend like I'm an end user and I want to run the report, but I don't want my end users to see the contents of this, or more specifically edit or break anything. I want their user experience to be nice and simple, to open up a workspace like this and see the reports that they need, that they have access to. I'm going to log in as a new user. I have another browser open here, and this browser has authenticated to Power BI under a different user account. So if I look at my previous one here, you'll see that this account here is my test user A, and I'm going to go over to this one, and we're going to see that this one is logged in as test user B. So test user A is kind of like my Power BI developer person, and test user B is a report consumer type person. Now, test user B does not have access to the Evolve DWH workspace, and that's good. We don't want them to have access to that workspace. We only want them to have access to the reports that we publish for them in the workspace that is relevant to them. So let's open up our Scottish Summit demo report, and oh no, there's a problem. You cannot see the content of this report because you do not have permissions to the underlying data set. Please contact the dataset owner to request access. Okay, so I don't want them to have access to that workspace, the DWH workspace, but I want them to run the report. And this is where a specific access type comes in called build access. So I'm going to pop back open. Now I'm logged back in as test user A, so this is my developer person. I'm in my Evolve DWH workspace. Now, in terms of access, you can see that my test user B has no access to this workspace. I don't want them to. I don't want them to have, certainly not admin or member access. I don't want them to have a contributor access, and I don't even want them to have a viewer access. I don't want them to see anything in this workspace, but I do want them to have the ability to read the data that's inside this DWH dataset. So there's another level of access that we can grant to them. And it's done on a dataset by dataset basis. Within this dataset here, you can have a look in Manage Permissions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add test user B to have access to the Vandingo Evolve DWH dataset specifically for read purposes. So I'm going to put test user B in here. And we want to be very careful with our tick boxes here. What we certainly do not want, and this is a bit dangerous if you want to control your security, is that I don't want test user B to then subsequently grant access to other people by sharing that report with people that you don't have control over. It would be best practice to use security groups in here rather than individual emails, which would allow you to grant and revoke access a little bit more effectively through Office 365 security groups. So I'm going to turn off that option there. We're going to add test user B, and here they are. They're added in. They have both read and build access to that data set. So I'm going to pop back open my workspace, evolve viz. I'm going to press F5 just to refresh. And now I'm going to open my Scottish Summit demo report, and test user B, my report consumer type person, now has access to the report, and they don't have access to that workspace. And that's exactly what I want. So let's do a quick recap on the moving parts that we've just changed in order to evolve our solution from a single file into multiple components, and how that lines up with the overall components of a general BI solution that we talked about earlier. At the top of this slide, you can see the same diagram that we had in one of our very early slides. So our typical BI solution has SSIS, or Azure Data Factory, for the data acquisition, relational databases or SQL database in the cloud for storing relational data. Our semantic model, we have analysis services or Azure analysis services, and then our data viz layer where we can have SSRS, Power BI, or many, many tools that can connect into our data models. So what have we done, and how have we separated our one file into multiple components to look at a new evolved architecture? So our get data and our storage now has data flows which play the part of Power Query to acquire and transform that data, and then the common data model or Azure storage to store the result set of those queries. Those queries are available through Power BI Desktop if you use the built-in data flow storage, or like mentioned before, you can change that to use your own provisioned Azure storage. You pay the cost for that, but it does make them available for other tools outside Power BI Desktop. The shared data model is simply a Power BI Desktop file playing the role of a data model only. So that data model is going to connect to our data flows. So the workload of querying has been done elsewhere. The data model will create relationships between those result sets. We can add DAX calculations for the intelligence. And what we don't do is create pages of reports on that file. As mentioned earlier, there's nothing stopping you. There's no technical restriction from creating reports on that file. But what we do is try to minimize that and publish that as a file on its own, playing the role of a shared data set, of a data set. The last thing we do is now create reports for different people and publish them to different workspaces as live connected PBIX files. So you can open up the same PBIX file that you did before, and instead of having to do any work of querying data or restructuring data or any data modeling, your end users can now open up a file and connect to a provisioned, prepared, structured, and best practice data model and create and publish their own reports into their own workspaces relevant to them. So you could have a 5 to 10 finance team group with 1 or 2 people creating and publishing reports for their organization or for their team, and a whole separate workspace of salespeople creating sales reports for the sales folks, and they're published completely independently, but everybody pointing to the same source location. That brings me to the end of this session. I want to thank everybody for attending. I hope you got some great content in growing your enterprise or BI solution into an enterprise architecture. This is a recorded session. It will be available within a period of around 14 days, I believe, through YouTube. and all the slides and so forth will be available to you as well. I will be on hand on the actual day of this delivery answering questions, so hope you've been chatting away and getting some answers from me and other members of the committee. So everyone have a great day, enjoy the rest of the conference, and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.